Well, hello all of you. I guess it's time for us to think about starting our reading of this book, The House of 60 Fathers. Now, it was written a long while ago, when I was only, I think about 3 years old, and I didn't know the book when I was young, but when I did discover it, I read it to this pair, who you might recognise, sort of. Maybe they might have been even a touch younger than in this photograph. So they had the whole book read to them. Here we have a young Susan. She had it read to her, I think, when she was older. And here we have this pair. Now Laurie had it read to her, the whole book. Lucy, I think, missed out on this particular book, but she can now catch up. Okay. The House of 60 Fathers. Now, it's pretty much based on a true story. You'll find there's an American in it. An American pilot. And actually, he wasn't American, but he wrote this book, Mijn Dirtlook Dijon. He was Dutch, but he was with the Americans in the Second World War as a pilot. And him and his friends are the 60 Fathers, who looked after a young boy who had helped Dijon when his plane crashed and got him back to his friends. So they sort of looked after this boy, because he'd lost his family at that point. And this is the story of Tien Pao, that boy who loses his family because the Second World War came early to China. Because the Japanese attacked China. Here you can see, there's us. If you look carefully, you can just see Belper. There's Africa. And round the corner, just out of sight, round the sweep of the world around there, is of course China. In those days it was a very poor country, whereas Japan, which you can see there, this is all China. Here, Japan is smaller but much more industrial, so they had big warships and lots of aeroplanes and lots of weapons. The Chinese were pretty much, let's say, they were poor people, just farming mainly, rice paddies, working in the rice paddies. And there's a drawing of Tien Pao and the little family pig, which you'll discover is called Glory of the Republic. China being a republic, Republic of China. So, without too much further ado, let's get a better look. Well, you see this very old book falling to pieces, look. Now look, there's Tien Pao with his chopsticks and his bowl to eat his rice from, if he can find any. I've never been any good with chopsticks. What about you, Sam and Emma? Have you been any good with chopsticks? The story's going to start as we enter chapter 1 which is called Rain on the Sampan. You'll think, well, what's a sampan? There, look. Rain on the Sampan, chapter 1. That's a sampan. It's like a sort of houseboat. It's like a long homemade boat with straw roof and a little porch there at the front, look, to sit under out of the rain. And here you can see the water of the river. Big rivers are rising. There's been a lot of rain, pretty much like there was for you a month or two ago when Anna's house was under threat from the rising River Derwent at Belper, and when Lucy took those wonderful pictures of the huge bales of hay sweeping down the river through Matlock. Yeah. So here we go. I think down. There we go. Okay. Rain raised the river. Rain beat down on the sampan, where it lay in a long row of sampans tied to the riverbank. Rain drummed down on the mats that were shaped in the form of an arched roof over the middle of the sampan. It clattered hard on the 4 long oars lying on top of the roof of mats. The rain found a bullet hole in the roof of mats. Thick drops of water dripped through the bullet hole onto the neck of the family pig. Sleeping on the floor of the sampan, the little pig twitched his neck every time a big cold drop of water hit it, but he went on sleeping. T.M. Powell looked on in quiet amusement to see how many cold drops it would take to wake the pig. It took 9. Then, with a disgusted grunt, the little pig slid over just far enough to get his neck from under the drip. But the drip from the bullet hole began making a big puddle on the floor. With his bare toes, T.M. Powell shoved the dishpan with the 3 ducklings under the drip. He settled himself on the bench again and leaned his head against the wall of mats. The little pig was sound asleep. The ducklings went to sleep in a little huddle at the bottom of their dishpan. The drumming of the rain on the matting overhead became so monotonous. Drip, 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 drip. T.M. Powell's head began to nod. Under half-shut eyelids he saw the sleeping ducklings rise on the water that dripped into their pan. They drifted in their sleep. The big, monotonous drops kept stirring the water. Rain raised the river. The sampans swayed and bobbed on the rising water. Voices drifted from the other sampans in the long row of sampans. The long row of sampans, and muttered among the drumming rain. T.M. Powell closed his eyes and almost slept. And yet he didn't sleep. He sat, sagged against the mats, dreamily remembering the hard days just past. The hard journey. It had been a long journey. T.M. Powell had lost count of all the days and nights. But all those nights when the horns of the new moon had stood dimly in the sky. Yes, horns of the new moon had stood dimly in the sky. T.M. Powell and his father and mother had pushed the sampan on and on against the currents of the endless rivers, day and night. There was no stopping even at night. "We won't stop until we drop," Tien Pao's father had kept saying over and over, "and we won't drop until we are far inside this great land of China, far from the sea, for where the sea is, there the Japanese invaders are." The family pig, the 3 ducklings, and the little stone mill to grind the rice for the baby sister, these they had saved from the mud house of the family of Tien, that had stood a little beyond their village of the corner of the mountains where the rivers meet. Because, like in a lot of the world, places are often called by the name of where they are. So where I live here in Ecclesfield, Eccles is church, Ecclesfield, the field with the church, because it was the big important church amongst the villages around here, Ecclesfield. And their village was called the corner of the mountains where the rivers meet, but there'd have been a string of Chinese words pulled together. I don't know what it was called in Chinese, but they had a mud house there, and they've saved from it the family pig, the 3 ducklings, and the little stone mill to grind the rice for the baby sister. Besides these, they had saved absolutely nothing, except Tien Pao's baby sister, Beauty of the Republic. Suddenly, one morning, the Japanese had come. Bullets had whined through the crooked streets of the village. Bullets had pierced the mud walls of the houses. People had screamed. There had been terrible screams inside the houses. The Japanese soldiers had come in at one end of the village, and like a herd of lowing cattle, the villagers had run out at the other end, to the river and the sampans. They had crowded into the sampans. They had shoved them madly into the river. Over the river had come a snarling roar. Japanese planes had burst out of the clouds, had hurtled themselves at the crowded sampans. Bullets had stuttered out of the screeching, diving planes. A horrible hail of bullets had slammed into the sampans. Back and back the planes had come with their hail of bullets, while sampans sank and went under. Back and back, until there was but one empty sampan left drifting on the water. And then the planes had come no more, not for one empty sampan. It had drifted silently, empty. The family of Tien Pao had seen it all from the clump of bamboos at the edge of the river where they had crouched. The planes had passed. The air above the river was still and empty. But now the shooting in the village had drawn nearer. "Now, now," Tien Hisu, the father, had whispered in the bamboo clump to his little family. "It is now or never." He had plunged into the river after the drifting sampan. Tien Pao and his mother, with Beauty of the Republic strapped to her back, had plunged after him. His mother had the rice mill. Tien Pao had the family pig under one arm, the dishpan with the ducklings squeezed against his chest. But his father had boarded the empty sampan, and his father had pulled everything and everybody on board. He had simply pulled Tien Pao up by his head and his neck, while Tien Pao clung to the pig and the dishpan. Then Tiao's father had run to the back of the sampan and had grabbed the oars. Tien Pao had started for the front of the sampan to take the oars there, but his mother had caught him and flung him to the floor of the sampan. "No," she whispered fiercely. Children must live. She'd unstrapped the baby and had pushed her at Tien Pao, where he lay on the floor. She made Tien Pao hold his hand over the hole made by a Japanese bullet on the floor of the sampan. And she had gone to the oars at the front of the sampan. On the floor, Tien Pao had held Beauty of the Republic tightly against him, while with his other hand he'd twisted his cap into a prop to shove into the bullet hole through which the river water came welling. He had lain on the prop to keep the water from pushing it out again, and he'd lain half over the baby sister to shield her if the aeroplanes and the bullets should come again. His father and mother had stood upright at the oars, but no bullets had come. No aeroplanes had hurtled at them out of the clouds. But behind him, Tien Pao had heard the roar of the flames as the whole village burned. The flames, in a great hungry sweep, had rushed from thatched roof to thatched roof, and the hollow bamboo framework inside the mud walls had exploded with the terrifying sound of guns. Sparks had rained on the river from the explosions, and the sampan had swept on in water gone red from the flames. In the leaping, sharp brightness of the flames, Tien Pao's mother and father stood upright. Stern and silent at the great oars, they had pushed the sampan up the river away from the sparks and explosions of the roaring village. The sampan had gone up many rivers in the following days and nights. One of the great rivers, out of the great rivers, as rivers grow great as they near the sea, into small and narrowing rivers the farther they went inland. Push and pull and push at the long sweeping oars, day and night. Always against the current. Tien Pao had taken his turn at the oars for long hard hours, spelling his father or his mother by night or by day in the endless hard journey. Now at last the sampan lay tied to the bank at the end of a long row of sampans that belonged at this river town of Hengyang. This was Tien Pao's first whole day of rest. Tien Pao's father and mother had not rested. The family of Tien was now safe from the Japanese, but they were penniless in a strange big city. There was no food in the sampan. They had the sampan and nothing else. They must find work immediately or starve. Last night the Hengyang River people on the other sampans had told them that there was much work at a great field for aeroplanes not many miles from the town. This morning, in the early dark rainy dawn, Tien Pao's father and his mother, with the baby, Beauty of the Republic, strapped to her back, they had gone with their new neighbours. Now it was late afternoon, and they had not come back. It must mean that they were working for the white foreigners, the American airmen, who had come over the ocean from a strange far land to help the Chinese fight the Japanese invaders. Tien Pao had not understood it too well when last night the new neighbours had explained about the great airfield to his father. He had been too stupefied with weariness. He had not known that aeroplanes needed fields, almost as if they were cows or grazing goats. He had never seen a white foreigner. But aeroplanes, he knew. Planes came screaming out of the sky, and out of them bullets stuttered, and then water spat, and sampans sank, and people fell, and the whole village burned, while in an empty river, red from flames, one sampan drifted on red water. Tien Pao moaned aloud. His own moan roused him. He jumped to his feet and stood shivering. He shook himself to get rid of the evil memories. It was rain dark inside the sampan, and the dark was scary. He was scared. He hurried to the saucer of oil that stood before the mirror in the little altar to the river god, and tremblingly lit the wick. It's an oil lamp. The flickering, smoking saucer lamp was reflected in the altar mirror and sent yellow rays of light over the ducklings and the pig. Tien Pao looked at them, and not at the wedge of wood that had been driven into the sampan floor to close the hole made by the Japanese bullet, but his lips mumbled, grateful for the light. "The light is good, and the river god that sent us the sampan is good," he whispered, but he couldn't help the last little shiver that still ran through him as he bowed himself before the altar of the good river god who had sent the sampan and had saved the whole family of Tien. Outside, all at once, the other sampans became noisy, with shouts. The rain must have stopped. For a moment the sinking evening sun shone briefly bright over the river. Women and children from all the sampans were swarming up the river bank, out shouting each other to attract the attention of some passenger who wanted to be ferried across the river. Tien Pao peered through a crack in the mats, but he couldn't see the top of the bank. He pushed the mat aside and stepped out, but when he looked up the high bank, he had to cling to the matting for support. On top of the river bank stood the river god. It must be the river god. His hair was golden, and his face was white. In that white face were pale blue eyes. People had dark hair, dark eyes. It must be the river god. At that moment, the god on top of the river bank looked right at Tien Pao. Then he came plunging down the high bank straight towards Tien Pao and the narrow gangplank that reached from the sampan to the shore. Tien Pao clutched the matting. "Mother!" he croaked. He could stand there no longer. He dived into the sampan, shoved the mats across the opening. He looked wildly about him. He grabbed the sleeping pig. The family pig was the best thing he had. He'd offer the pig to the river god. He dashed with the little pig to the far end of the sampan and stood trembling before the river god's own altar. The mats parted. The golden-haired, blue-eyed god stepped into the sampan. And that is where we'll take our first break. And we'll wait and see what happens to Tien Pao as his adventures really begin. Goodbye to Tien Pao for now.